My name is Emma Blake. I'm 32 years old, a florist by trade, and I live in a small, quiet town just outside Portland, Oregon. I run a cozy flower shop on Main Street where I spend most of my days arranging bouquets for weddings, birthdays, and sometimes even funerals. But above all, I'm a mother. Not biologically, but by choice, by love, really. My daughter's name is Sophie. She's 8 years old. I adopted her after my cousin passed away in a tragic car accident when Sophie was barely 3. From the moment she stepped into my arms, small, scared, and silent, I knew she was mine in every way that mattered. Last week, I had to leave for a 2-day business trip in San Diego. It wasn't ideal, but the event was important, and Scott, my husband, had to attend a conference in Seattle the same week. We didn't want Sophie to be alone, so we asked Scott's parents, Marianne and Harold, to stay at our house and look after her. I won't lie, I hesitated. Their affection for Sophie had always been lukewarm. They weren't unkind exactly, but there was a subtle stiffness in how they spoke to her a distance that grew more obvious as Sophie grew older and their biological granddaughter, Olivia, came into the picture. But Scott convinced me it would be fine. They love her, he had said. They just show it differently. I landed back in Portland that Thursday afternoon earlier than expected. The meeting had wrapped up quickly, and all I could think about was coming home, hugging Sophie, and hearing about her 2 days with her grandparents. I unlocked the front door around 4:30 p.m., expecting the sound of cartoons from the living room, maybe the scent of cookies, or even just Sophie running toward me, arms wide open. But the house was quiet. Not just calm, but unsettlingly silent. And there was a strong chemical smell in the air. Bleach, maybe? Too strong. I rolled my suitcase inside and called out Sophie. No answer. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, heart starting to pound for reasons I couldn't explain. That's when I saw her. Sophie was on her knees, crouched over a wet kitchen floor, scrubbing hard at something with a damp rag. A half-full bucket of gray water sat next to her. Her sleeves were soaked, and the knees of her leggings were stained. She didn't look up right away. Her tiny hands moved in repetitive, tired motions, and when I got closer, I saw the rawness of her knuckles, the pink irritation around her fingers. "Sophie," I said again, softer this time. She stopped, slowly, turned her head, and met my eyes. Her lips trembled slightly, but she didn't cry. "I spilled grape juice," she whispered. "On the floor. Ba said I had to clean it before they got back." Ba, that was what she called Marianne. "Where are they?" I asked, kneeling beside her. "They took Olivia to Disneyland," she said, her voice low and flat. I blinked. "They took Olivia where?" "To Disneyland," she repeated. "Just her, not me." I stared at her, trying to make sense of the words, trying to calm the sudden surge in my chest. "Did they say why?" She nodded once, very slowly. "Ba said, I'm not really their granddaughter, so I didn't need to go." There it was, the sentence that burned a hole straight through my ribs. She said it so simply, like she had already accepted it as truth. My daughter, 8 years old, already learning how to fold herself smaller to fit in places that were never meant for her. I reached out and touched her arm. Her skin was cold. I helped her to her feet, led her down the hall, and ran a warm bath. I said nothing, not because I didn't have words, but because I didn't trust what might come out if I opened my mouth. Rage had no place around her. I helped her undress, and when I saw the red streaks on her wrists, my hands trembled slightly. I washed her arms gently, then wrapped her in the softest towel we owned. I helped her into her favorite pajamas, the ones with tiny yellow flowers, and braided her damp hair. She didn't say much, just followed every motion quietly. In the kitchen, I made grilled cheese and tomato soup, sliced apples, and added cinnamon the way she liked it. She ate in small bites, hunched slightly over the table, her shoulders rounded in. After dinner, we watched a movie, but she fell asleep halfway through her head resting on my lap. I sat there for a long time, not watching the screen, just listening to her breathing. Later, I cleaned the bucket, the rag, the floor. I moved like someone going through sacred rituals. That's when I saw it, the silver scarf. Marianne's scarf. The one I gave her last Christmas. It was draped over the back of a chair, the tag still attached. never worn, unloved, just like how they had treated Sophie. I picked it up and dropped it in the trash. Then I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. I started typing. Thursday, 4:37 p.m. Returned home early. Found Sophie alone scrubbing the kitchen floor with a bucket of bleach water. She stated Marianne and Harold took Olivia to Disneyland and told her she was not a real granddaughter. No supervision, no apology, no message left. I stared at the blinking cursor for a long time, then added one more line. They will never be allowed near her again. I shut the laptop, walked back to the couch, and pulled the blanket up to Sophie's chin. I kissed her forehead, whispered, "You are mine," and sat beside her in the silence they left behind. Sophie came into my life in the most tragic way imaginable. My cousin Laura, more like a sister than anything else, was driving home from her night shift at the hospital when a truck ran a red light. She was killed instantly. Sophie, then barely 3 years old, had been asleep in the back seat. She survived with nothing more than a scratch on her cheek. There was no father in the picture. Laura had never put a name on the birth certificate, and whatever story she carried with her about Sophie's biological dad, she took to her grave. When I stepped into the hospital room that morning, everything inside me knew what I had to do. I didn't need a judge to tell me. I didn't need permission. I looked into that little girl's tear-streaked face and said, "I've got you." And from that moment forward, I did. The process of adoption was slow, bureaucratic, and at times exhausting, but none of that mattered. I was already her mother. The paperwork just caught up to what our hearts already knew. A year later, I married Scott. He loved Sophie in the quiet, steadfast way that mattered most. He read her bedtime stories, held her when she had night terrors, taught her how to ride a bike. When we signed the final adoption papers, he wrote his name beside mine. We chose her together. But not everyone in Scott's family accepted that choice. Marianne and Harold, his parents, were polite at best, cold at worst. At holidays, they gave Sophie presents, sure, but always smaller, always less thoughtful. One Christmas, Olivia unwrapped a karaoke machine with flashing lights and a microphone. Sophie received a coloring book and a set of crayons. When she looked at me with confusion in her eyes, I told her gently, "Not everyone gives the same way. Some people show love differently." It was the lie I told to protect her heart and maybe my own. At family dinners, they'd ask Olivia how school was going, how dance class was, what she wanted to be when she grew up. When Sophie answered questions unprompted, they'd nod vaguely as if her words didn't quite stick. Once Marianne corrected her grammar mid-sentence, then turned the conversation to Olivia's summer camp scholarship. I used to think they just needed time, that they didn't know how to love a child they hadn't watched grow from birth. I convinced myself it was generational, that they weren't trying to be cruel, just awkward, maybe unsure. I wanted to believe they were capable of growing into the role of grandparents. I wanted to believe Sophie could belong. But that Thursday shattered any illusions I had left. Coming home to find Sophie on the floor, scrubbing like a maid while they rode roller coasters with Olivia, wasn't just a moment of bad judgment. It was the culmination of every small dismissal, every tight-lipped smile, every gift wrapped without care. It was a message they had never spoken out loud, until now, she's not one of us. And worse, they had said it to her. I kept thinking about Sophie's voice, quiet, uncertain as she said the words. "Ba said I'm not really their granddaughter, not even with malice." Just the repetition of something she'd been told so many times it had become fact. That kind of belief doesn't come from a single day. It grows slowly like mold. It infects. I spent most of that night awake, lying beside her, watching the gentle rise and fall of her chest. She'd curled into my side, her little fingers gripping the edge of my shirt. As if even in sleep she was afraid I'd disappear too. That's when I made the decision. Not a rash one. Not fueled by revenge or anger. It was quieter than that. Like a door closing for good. I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't send long, angry texts. I would act, thoughtfully, legally, strategically, because this wasn't just about hurt feelings. This was about safety, emotional, psychological, and yes, even physical. They had left her alone, with bleach, unsupervised. They had told her she didn't belong, that she was something temporary. I knew then I would never allow them to stand in a room with my daughter again unless I had full control of that space. Whatever bond they thought they had through Scott, through blood, it meant nothing if they couldn't see Sophie as ours. Fully, equally, unconditionally. They had underestimated me. They'd thought I would shrug it off, apologize for the misunderstanding, try to smooth things over for the sake of family peace. But I wasn't that woman anymore. And I wasn't just a mother. I didn't raise my voice, not once, not when I saw the rag in her hands, not when I heard what they'd said to her, and not even later that evening when the reality of it all settled into my bones. There was a time in my life when I would have exploded, sent an angry text, called in tears, demanded answers. But motherhood had rewired me. It had taught me that some battles don't require noise. Some require patience, precision, and a deep sense of purpose. After Sophie fell asleep on the couch, I lifted her into my arms and carried her to bed. She didn't stir. Her weight against me felt both light and heavy light, like a child who trusted me enough to rest heavy, like the grief she hadn't yet learned how to name. I tucked her in, turned off the light, and sat in the doorway for a few minutes, just watching her breathe. Then I got to work. The first thing I did was write everything down. Every word Sophie had said, every detail she'd described. I opened a locked file on my laptop and began logging it chronologically. When she spilled the juice at lunch. How Marianne scolded her. How Harold stayed silent. How they told her it was Olivia's special day. That she wasn't a real granddaughter. That cleaning up the mess was her responsibility while they went to Disneyland. She told me Marianne had made her wash the baseboards, too. That she wasn't allowed to play with the tablet. That she'd eaten lunch alone while Olivia sat next to Ba and showed her TikTok dances. She told Olivia she was proud of her, Sophie had whispered. But she didn't say anything to me. I logged that, too, word for word. Because pain like that needed to be witnessed. When I finished, I backed up the file twice, one in the cloud, one on a hard drive. Then I made a call. My friend Dana is a family attorney. We'd met years ago at a yoga class and kept in touch over the years. She picked up on the second ring. "Emma," she said, "everything okay?" "Not exactly," I said. "I need advice on a non-emergency custody boundary. I want to file a limited contact restriction. Quietly for now. No confrontation. Just a wall." She paused. "Is this about Sophie?" "Yes," I said. "She was left alone for 5 hours. With bleach. And emotional damage I can't undo." "I'm on it," she replied. "I'll draft a protective memorandum. You can review it in the morning." I thanked her, hung up, and walked into my office. I sat at my desk and opened an old leather-bound notebook. It had been blank for years, waiting for the right purpose. At the top of the first page, I wrote for Sophie. Then I began writing her a letter, not for now, but for the future. One day you'll ask me why I made certain choices, why I built walls, why I didn't let some people back in. And I want you to know it wasn't out of hate. It was because I saw the way you looked at the door when they left. And I vowed you would never feel that small again. When the words dried up, I closed the book, placed it in the drawer, and turned back to the screen. Next, I opened an account, a savings account in Sophie's name. No joint holders, no access but mine and hers someday. I deposited a small sum to start. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, a quiet seed planted for her future, the kind of future where love wasn't conditional. By midnight, I had made one more decision. The next morning, I called a security installation service. Not for alarm systems, for cameras. I requested discreet placements, living room, kitchen, hallway, audio included. Not because I wanted to spy, but because I needed proof. If Marianne and Harold ever returned, if they ever spoke again, with that same cold edge or laid expectations on Sophie that didn't belong on any child's shoulders, I would have more than Sophie's word. I would have footage, documentation. I didn't tell Scott right away. He wasn't home yet. He wouldn't be for another 2 days. I needed time to figure out how to say it all without it exploding between us. He loved Sophie, I knew that. But family loyalty runs deep, and denial is seductive when it's easier than confrontation. So I waited, and I built. Each quiet move was a layer of protection, not just for the next time, but for every time that might come. Because they had shown me exactly who they were. And now I would show them who I had become. Scott got home on Saturday afternoon. His flight landed late, and he walked through the front door with the usual tired smile and an overnight bag slung over his shoulder. He kissed me on the cheek, dropped his bag by the bench, and immediately asked, "Where's Sophie?" "She's at Mia's for a sleepover," I said, handing him a glass of water. He took a long sip, then looked at me. "How'd it go?" "With my parents." I didn't answer right away. I just walked over to my desk, opened the laptop, and clicked play on the audio file I'd saved. I had taken the liberty of isolating Sophie's quiet voice from the rest of the conversation. It was only 14 seconds long. That's all it needed to be. Scott stood still, one hand wrapped around the glass, the other resting at his side as the speakers played. "Ba said it was only Olivia's turn because she's real family. She said, I'm just something Daddy brought home." There was a pause. Then her voice again, even quieter. She said, "I'm not really wanted, just tolerated." When the file ended, I didn't say a word. I closed the laptop gently, like sealing something sacred, and waited. Scott sat down slowly at the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. Not for a long time. When he finally looked up, his voice was raw, but clear. "We're not letting anyone make her feel that small again." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a decision. He took out his phone and stared at it for a second. "You recorded this?" he asked. "She told me right after you left. I didn't trust myself to explain it the right way. I needed you to hear it from her." He nodded once, then dialed. I watched him pace the hallway as the phone rang. He didn't raise his voice when Marianne answered. He didn't accuse. But the way his tone dropped flat, factual, restrained, made the hair on my arms stand up. "Mom," he said, "I just listened to something Sophie told us. About what happened Thursday. About what was said to her." There was a long pause on the other end. Scott continued. "She told us you said she's not really your granddaughter. That she was only staying behind because Olivia is real family." Another pause. His expression didn't change. "No, I'm not mistaken," he said, cutting her off. "We have a recording." I saw his knuckles tighten around the phone. "Don't say it was taken out of context. There is no context where that's okay." More silence. Then finally he said, "You won't be seeing her for a while. If ever." He hung up before she could respond. He turned to me, eyes still red, but his body was steady. "She didn't even deny it," he said. "Not really. She tried to spin it, make it sound like a joke, like Sophie misunderstood. But she didn't. She understood exactly." We sat in silence for a while. The air between us was heavy, but not with blame. It was with something closer to mourning, the realization that something irreparable had split open, something Scott had tried to protect for years. "I used to think they just didn't know how to love her," he said. "I gave them time. I made excuses. But now I see it. They knew exactly what they were doing. They didn't see her as ours, just yours." I put my hand on his. "You know better now." "I do," he whispered. "And they'll never get another chance." Later that evening, he sat down beside me as I drafted the formal no-contact request with our attorney. He read every line, suggested none, just signed when I handed him the document. Afterward, he brought a folded envelope from his jacket pocket. "I was going to wait," he said, "but I think we should open this now." It was a letter from the private school we had been considering for Sophie. Acceptance, a small scholarship, a place where she wouldn't have to sit beside someone who believed she was less than. I looked at him, then down at the paper, then back again. "Are you sure?" I asked. "I want her to be somewhere that mirrors what we teach her at home. that love is a choice, that family is chosen, that her worth isn't up for debate. That night we sat on the couch side by side, a quiet understanding between us. We had different bloodlines, different upbringings, but the line had been drawn, and he stood on the right side of it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't burn bridges with fire. He simply chose her. And that changed everything. I still remember the first night Sophie came home. She was 3.5, wrapped in an oversized denim jacket that wasn't hers. Her shoes didn't match. Her tiny backpack was stuffed with a single stuffed bear, worn and missing an eye. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't cry, wouldn't sleep. She just sat on the edge of the bed, her legs swinging over the side, looking out the window like someone waiting to be taken back. That night, I stayed with her. I sang softly, even though she didn't know the song. I laid beside her and told her what was outside a garden that would bloom in spring, a cat named Maple who liked to sleep in the sink, and a hallway that always creaked on the third step. She didn't respond. But sometime after midnight, I felt a small hand reach for mine under the covers. That was the beginning. She didn't speak for weeks, not more than a whisper. When she did, her voice always carried an echo of caution, like she wasn't sure if words were safe in this new house. But slowly she began to open. She would hum to herself while stacking blocks. She'd leave little drawings under the fridge magnets. And one day, while I was folding laundry, I heard her talking to the cat, telling it she liked this home better than the last one, because the light doesn't flicker here. That's when I knew we were building something real. Over time, Sophie became a storyteller. She started writing little rhymes on sticky notes and leaving them around the house. Some made sense, others didn't, but all of them were hers. She wrote about trees with secret doors, clouds shaped like cookies, and once a poem that simply read, "My heart used to feel like a hallway with too many shoes." Now it's a room with windows. I kept that one in my wallet. She became more than my daughter. She became proof that healing doesn't look like forgetting. It looks like rebuilding. It looks like choosing each other again every single day. But maybe what I haven't said, what I only admitted to myself years later, is that I understood Sophie's silence because I had once lived inside it too. I grew up in a house where love was measured by resemblance. If you looked like them, thought like them, acted like them, you belonged. I didn't. I was the odd one, the sensitive one, the one who asked too many questions and read too many books and cried too easily. At 12, I overheard my uncle whisper to my father, "That girl doesn't fit in, does she?" And my father had said nothing. Not yes, not no, just silence. It's strange how those things stay with you. The moments no one defends you. The rooms where you're physically present, but emotionally invisible. I spent years trying to blend in, trying to become smaller, easier to like. But love that has to be earned never really feels like love. It feels like debt. So when Laura died, and I was asked whether I could take Sophie, my heart didn't hesitate. I recognized that child, her stillness, her guarded eyes. I had been her, and I would be damned if she grew up thinking she had to shrink to be loved. I remember one night years ago when she asked, "Do I look like you?" I shook my head gently. "No, baby, you don't." She looked worried. "Then how do people know I'm yours?" I smiled and pulled her into my lap. "Because I stayed. Because I chose you. Because when everything changed, I didn't run." She nodded, satisfied, and never asked again. A few days after Scott made the call to his parents, we were out in the garden. Sophie was collecting fallen petals and organizing them by color. I sat beside her on the grass. She looked up at me and asked, "Why don't I see Grandma Marianne anymore?" I didn't flinch. "Because some people only know how to love part of you, and I want you surrounded by people who love you whole." She was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." I pulled her close, brushed a leaf from her hair and whispered, "Family isn't who gave you your name, Sophie. It's who stays when the door shuts. It's who chooses to stay every time." She didn't say anything, but I saw something soften in her shoulders, like maybe she was beginning to believe it. Years from now, when she looks back on her childhood, I want her to remember moments like that. Not the floor she was made to scrub, not the words that tried to make her feel less, but the way we rewrote the definition of family. How we built a tree with roots deeper than blood roots made of time, choice, loyalty, and love that never asks to be earned. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It came in a pale blue envelope addressed in careful cursive with a single flower stamp pressed into the corner. At first, I didn't recognize the handwriting, but when I saw the return address, I stood still in the kitchen envelope in hand for a full minute before opening it. Marianne. It had been almost 3 weeks since Scott's phone call, since the audio recording, since the silence that followed, not even a text. But now, here it was, ink on paper, a slow confession wrapped in paper we hadn't asked for. I read it alone, leaning against the kitchen counter while Sophie was in her room working on one of her poems. It started formally, "Dear Emma and Scott," and moved quickly into an apology that felt both carefully crafted and strangely sincere. She wrote about how she was raised, how in her family love had always followed rules about blood legacy resemblance. "I was taught to see family through a very narrow lens," she wrote, "and I carried that lens into the way I looked at Sophie. That was my failure." She didn't ask for forgiveness outright, but she did say she regretted the words she spoke, that they had come from a place of ignorance, not cruelty, that she didn't realize what she'd said would land like a knife, that she hadn't realized Sophie was old enough to understand. But she was, and that was the whole point. Wasn't it? I read the letter twice, once for content, once for tone. Then I folded it back up and placed it inside a drawer. I didn't want to decide anything alone. That evening, while the pasta boiled and the dog snored softly by the door, I asked Sophie to come sit at the table. I told her about the letter. I said Marianne had written to say she was sorry. Sophie looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the grain in the wood. "Is she sorry because she hurt me?" she asked slowly, "or because now she doesn't get to see me?" It wasn't a child's question. It was clean, sharp, and honest, and I couldn't answer for Marianne. "I don't know," I said truthfully, "but what I do know is that you don't have to decide anything tonight, or tomorrow, or ever if you don't want to." She nodded. "Can I read the letter?" I hesitated, then said, "Yes, but I'll read it with you, and you can stop me at any time." She agreed. We read it together slowly. She didn't cry. She didn't speak until the very end. She didn't say my name. Sophie noted softly. She wrote, "What I said to your daughter." But she didn't say me. That struck something in me. She was right. I think sometimes when people feel ashamed, they write around things I said, like they're afraid to look them straight in the face. Sophie nodded again. "Well, I'm not ready to see her. Not yet." "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to." Scott and I talked that night after she went to bed. He was gentler than I expected, quiet but present. "She's trying," he said, referring to his mother. "But trying late still has consequences." I agreed. We decided to write back. In the letter, I told Marianne that we acknowledged her apology and that we respected the effort it took to write it. But forgiveness wasn't a pass, it was a process. A process Sophie would lead, not us. I wrote, "If in the future Sophie expresses interest in reconnecting, it will be done in our home with one of us present. She will not be asked to hug, to smile, or to explain. She will not be guilted into comfort. She will not be pressed. If she declines to see you, that decision will be final. Your presence in her life will be on her terms now, not ours. We signed it together. I didn't send it through the mail. I drove to her house, slipped it into her mailbox, and left without knocking. The next day, Sophie asked if she could bake cookies. I said yes. We stirred flour and brown sugar chocolate chips and butter. And while the smell of vanilla filled the kitchen, she said something that stayed with me. "Do you think she meant it?" Sorry. I think I said she meant it in the way she's capable of. Some people grow slowly. Some people never do. But either way, it doesn't mean you have to open the door just because they knocked. She smiled faintly. "Okay." I think I like it closed for now. And that was enough for me. Sometimes forgiveness isn't a grand gesture. Sometimes it's a line drawn in soft chalk, a boundary that says, I'm healing, but I'm not inviting you in yet. Sometimes forgiveness looks like supervised visits, letters that go unanswered, cookies baked in a safe kitchen where no one tells you you're too much or not enough. We never told her to forgive. We told her she had the right to choose. And she did. We didn't want to go to court. Not the kind with wooden benches and legal filings. Not the kind with cross-examinations and echoes off marble walls. But what we needed was something just as formal, just as sacred, a court of the heart. A space where the rules would be said out loud, where lines would be drawn not out of anger, but protection. Where our daughter would know without doubt that her worth was not negotiable. Scott and I discussed it for days. The boundaries, the consequences, what was too much, what was not enough. The question was never whether Sophie would be loved, she already was deeply. The question was whether we would allow even a trace of harm to linger under the roof of family. Our lawyer Dana helped us draft a formal family agreement, not a lawsuit, but a binding record. In it, we clearly outlined that Sophie was our legal daughter, adopted and protected under every statute that mattered, that she had the same rights as any biological child, that any future contact with Sophie would require mutual consent, and that if she was ever subjected to emotional, verbal, or psychological harm, again, we would report it formally and without warning. It wasn't revenge, it was responsibility. We invited Marianne and Harold to meet at our home, Neutral Ground. Sophie wasn't there. She was spending the afternoon with her music teacher experimenting with a new ukulele Scott had bought her as an early birthday gift. We made tea, set out no snacks. This wasn't a visit. It was a conversation that had waited far too long. Marianne arrived stiffly, clutching a folder perhaps of her own defenses. Harold followed behind, slower, more subdued. He didn't make eye contact when I opened the door. We sat at the dining table. Scott on one side, me beside him. They sat across from us like two parents in a principal's office. Except this time they weren't the ones protecting a child. They were being asked to reckon with the damage they'd done to one. Scott spoke first. Calmly, directly. He laid out what we knew, what Sophie had said, what the audio file confirmed. He didn't embellish. He didn't accuse. He just told the truth. Marianne bristled. I never meant to hurt her, she said, her voice tight. You make it sound like I abused the child. No, I said, finally speaking. You made her feel like a mistake. That's different, but not better. She opened her folder, then perhaps to read a prepared apology, or perhaps just to place something between us and her. It was how I was raised, she started again. We didn't talk about feelings. We didn't. I know, I interrupted gently. And I'm not asking you to love her like she's your own blood. I'm not even asking you to love her at all. I'm asking you not to make her feel like a stain in this family. She went quiet. Harold finally looked up. His eyes watery around the edges met mine. He nodded just once. It was small, but honest. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence holds more truth than words. Scott slid the folder across the table. This is a formal agreement, he said. It's not a threat. It's a promise. To Sophie. From us. Marianne picked it up. Read the first few lines. Her face tightened, but she didn't push it away. So this is it then, she asked. I follow the rules or I don't see her at all. This is us creating safety, I said. You're not being punished. You're being told how to belong in her life. On her terms. There was a long pause. The air was still. She's just a child, Marianne said softer now. Children don't always understand the complexity, but they feel everything I said. And they remember. She already does. We ended the meeting not with a hug, not with reconciliation, but with clarity. They left the house quieter than when they came. Harold gave Scott a gentle squeeze on the shoulder. Marianne said nothing. That night when Sophie came home, she asked, Did you talk to them? I nodded. Yes, we did. And we told them that you matter too much to be hurt again. That from now on, how people treat you decides if they get to stay close. She smiled. That's what you always say. That love is what we do, not what we say. Exactly, I said. Love without protection isn't love. It's a costume. She leaned into me. I like our family, even if it's different. I kissed the top of her head. Different, I said, is what made it safe. The next morning, I hung a framed print above her bedroom door, a gift from a friend who knew our story. It read, "You are not too much. You are the exact amount of miracle the world needed." And under it in small type, family is not who shares your blood. It's who builds your safety. It showed up one Saturday morning without announcement or fanfare. Just a quiet moment in the kitchen, sunlight spilling across the counter, the kettle whistling softly in the background. I was slicing apples. Scott was pouring pancake batter onto the griddle a little too much as always, so the edges of the circles overlapped. Sophie padded into the room, still wearing her mismatched socks and flowered pajama pants, a rolled-up sheet of paper tucked under her arm. She walked straight to the refrigerator. With deliberate care, she unrolled the page, pressed it flat with her small palms, and pinned it beneath a cat magnet with only one eye, the same cat she'd drawn 100 times over the years. Then she stepped back and looked at it for a moment before slipping quietly onto one of the bar stools, reaching for a slice of apple like nothing had happened. But I saw it. And the second I did, something inside me went still. It was a drawing of a tree, wide and curved, full of thick branches and little looping leaves. At its base were 3 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one medium, and one small. Beneath them, in uneven crayon handwriting, were 3 names: Mommy, Daddy, me. That was it. No Olivia, no Grandma, no Grandpa, just us. I stared at it for a long moment, then glanced at Sophie. Her face was calm, focused on chewing her apple. She didn't look for a reaction. She didn't smile or explain. She just let it be. Later that afternoon, as we were folding laundry in the sun-drenched living room, I asked gently, "Sweetheart, I love your drawing on the fridge." She nodded, without looking up from the shirt she was trying to fold. "Thanks. I noticed it's just the 3 of us. Was that on purpose?" She shrugged, that beautiful little half-shrug kids do when they already know the answer, but want to see if you do too. "I only drew the people who always choose me," she said. Then after a beat, "Some people don't stay. That's okay. They just don't go in the picture." I didn't cry. I just nodded and reached over to help her smooth a wrinkle out of her shirt. Her words were not bitter. They weren't designed to wound. They were simply the truth spoken with the clarity of someone who's had to learn early and earnestly that love is not always loud, but it is always felt. That evening we baked together. Nothing fancy, just chocolate chip cookies with too much dough eaten off the spoon. Sophie stood on her usual stool beside the counter, hair tied messily with a glittery blue band. Scott read off ingredients from a flour-dusted cookbook, pretending not to know what came next, so she could correct him, which she did with mock seriousness and a finger pointed like a professor. The house was warm. Music played low from the speaker in the corner, one of Sophie's favorite songs about stars and found families and coming home. The smell of vanilla and cinnamon filled the air, and at one point, without even realizing it, we were all laughing. Loud, full-bellied laughter over something ridiculous. Maybe the flower on Scott's nose, or the dough that had somehow ended up on the ceiling. There was no tension, no shadows, just this small, perfect moment where nothing was broken and nothing needed to be fixed. And in that moment I understood something that had taken me 32 years to learn. Healing doesn't always come with justice. It doesn't always come with apology or punishment or balance. Sometimes it just comes with peace. With choosing every day the people who choose you back. With standing around a messy kitchen island laughing with the 2 people who remind you simply by being there that you are enough. I glanced over at the refrigerator where the drawing still hung slightly curled at the edges. A tree with 3 names. A new kind of family tree. No tangled branches. No ghosts hiding in the leaves.